Peter Singer was very recently on the Rick Roll podcast. They talked about long-termism, and actually Peter Singer said something I didn't think he would say. I wasn't expecting it, and it's relevant to antinatalism. But before we get into it, let's watch the clip.
But there's also the fact that when long-termists try to prevent extinction, and then they say there could be these vast numbers of human beings living rich and fulfilling lives as long as we don't do something that causes our species to become extinct, let's say this century or the next couple of centuries, then you do have to think about, well, if we did something that meant that we became extinct, these people wouldn't exist at all.
Mm-hmm.
So it wouldn't be like a child cutting their foot and getting hurt. It would be like there just would be nobody alive on the planet. Maybe there would be no sentient beings in this part of the universe. And some philosophers think that that's different, that we don't have an obligation to ensure that future people exist. Rather, we have an obligation to say that if people exist in future, we don't do anything that will harm them.
Now, the first thing I want to say here is that I don't actually think Peter Singer was necessarily saying this because he believes it. I think he was maybe saying it because he was sort of going over some things that people do think. But it was interesting nonetheless that he didn't just sort of regurgitate the standard long-termist talking points, and he actually did recognize that at least some people think, sure, we should avoid taking actions that will harm future generations that will exist, but whether or not we have an obligation to bring them into existence is a separate question altogether. What Peter Singer puts forward here, I think, is basically the antinatalist take on long-termism. But before we get onto that, I want to revisit something that he mentioned in that clip, which was something they spoke about earlier in the conversation, which was this thought experiment, which is a story by Parfit, which is basically supposed to explore whether or not we have certain obligations or duties to people who don't exist yet. And it's the story about a child cutting their foot on broken glass. And it goes like this. It's, imagine you're walking through the woods and you accidentally drop a bottle or something and there's some broken glass there. Now, Parfit asks, imagine that you know that eventually a child in the future will be running through that wood barefoot and will step on that broken glass and cut their foot. Is the fact that that child doesn't exist yet a reason not to clean up that glass? When you ask most people this, obviously they will say, yeah, you should clean up the glass. It doesn't matter if the kid doesn't exist now. If you know that the action you're taking is going to cause suffering or pain to someone in the future, then it's something that you should take into account. Now, the relevance to this story is that long-termists use this story or similar analogous stories to make the point that we should be giving serious consideration to people who don't exist yet but will exist, just like we would give serious consideration to that child who doesn't exist. But if we leave the broken glass there, they will cut their foot eventually. And that makes sense. But this is where we get back to the antinatalist take on this. What the antinatalist take is, well, that broken glass in that story, suffering is the broken glass. People in the future will always suffer, so there will always be broken glass in that forest. Now, the decision we have to make is whether we want to send a child running in that forest or not, knowing that there is going to be broken glass, whether we like it or not. Long-termists say, yeah, well, in the future, we can reduce the amount of broken glass in this forest over time and it'll get better and better. But antinatalists are saying those people, they never wanted to exist. Those children, they didn't exist to want to run in the forest. And so if you know there's broken glass in there at any level, why send them in there? And remember, we aren't depriving or harming them because they don't exist to want to come into this reality.
It's not as a long sort of cabinet full of potential ghost fetuses going, we want to be born, right?
And so if we know there's broken glass in the forest, let's just not send them in there. Anyway, this is just a quick video to respond to what Peter Singer said in that podcast with Rick Roll. I do plan to do a longer video on Peter Singer and long-termism separately in the future, but we'll get to that when I get to that. Anyway, let me know what you thought about what Peter Singer said in this Rick Roll podcast, and I'll see you in the next one.